Why did my stoic dad's dying confession make me rethink everything about my childhood? I was helping my dad clean out the garage when he suddenly stopped sorting through old boxes and asked if we could talk. He'd been diagnosed with heart failure 6 months earlier, and these deep conversations were becoming more common. Before, my dad was never one for emotional talks. He showed love by checking my tire pressure and making sure I had good health insurance. But that afternoon, his hands were shaking, and as he opened a beer, he told me he needed to share something before it was too late. He said he'd carried this secret for 30 years and didn't want to die with it eating at him. My mom had passed 5 years earlier from cancer, so I assumed this was about her. I was right, but not in the way I expected. The story started on their honeymoon in 1992. They'd gotten married at our family church with 200 guests and driven to a cabin in the mountains for a week. My dad was 23 and completely in love with Mom. He'd saved for months to make their honeymoon special, even brought champagne and roses to surprise her on their first night as husband and wife. But when he got to the cabin after picking up groceries in town, he found my mom in bed with someone else. She was with her cousin Vinny, who'd been at their wedding 12 hours earlier. Vinny, who'd given a toast about how lucky my dad was. Vinny, who'd been coming to family dinners since they were kids. My dad said he stood in the doorway holding grocery bags full of food for romantic dinners, while his new wife scrambled for clothes. Vinny just sat there shirtless. My mom started crying and begging my dad to let her explain. She said it wasn't what it looked like, even though they were both naked in the honeymoon bed. The part that killed me was how my dad handled it. Instead of leaving or starting a fight, he quietly put away the groceries. He slept on the couch that night while Mom cried in the bedroom. The next morning, he drove them both home in silence. He didn't tell anyone because he was too ashamed and confused to process it. They went to see their pastor the following week. Pastor Williams was old school and told my dad that marriage was sacred. He said forgiveness was the foundation of a union. He made my dad pray for the strength to move past this temptation and work on building a family. My dad was young and religious and thought maybe this was just a test of his faith. So they stayed married and pretended nothing happened. They moved into a little apartment and started their life together. My mom acted like the perfect wife, and my dad threw himself into his work. They went to church every Sunday and hosted family dinners where Vinny would sometimes show up. My dad said those dinners were torture, but he smiled through them. Things seemed to get better over the years. They bought a house and had me when they were 29. Becoming a father changed everything for him. He finally felt like they were a real family, and maybe the past could stay buried. He worked 60-hour weeks to give us a good life. He coached my little league team and never missed a school play. Then it happened again when I was 6. My dad came home early from a business trip and found my mom with Vinny in their bedroom. The same cousin, the same betrayal, except this time there was me to think about. A 6-year-old kid who loved his mom and had no idea why Daddy was sleeping in the guest room for a month. My dad said he packed a bag that night and was ready to leave. He'd gotten as far as loading his car when he came to check on me one last time. I was asleep clutching a teddy bear he'd bought me. He stood in my doorway realizing that if he left, I'd grow up in a broken home like he did. He unpacked his car and went back to pretending everything was fine. The conversation in the garage was getting heavy. My dad was crying, which I'd never seen before. He said staying was the biggest regret of his life. Not because he didn't love me, but because the stress and heartbreak had slowly killed him. The 60-hour weeks turned into health problems. The fake smiles turned into diabetes. The pretending turned into a heart attack at 50. He grabbed my hand with both of his and looked me in the eyes. He said he wanted me to have a normal family so badly that he sacrificed his own happiness. He spent 24 more years with my mom after the second betrayal. He smiled through family photos and anniversary parties. He even spoke beautifully at her funeral about their love story, while knowing it was all a lie. I sat there trying to process that my entire childhood had been built on this massive secret. Every Christmas morning, every family vacation, all an act by a man who just wanted his son to have stability. He told me he wished he'd left and found real love. He wished he'd shown me that self-respect mattered more than keeping up appearances. He wished he'd been happy instead of just pretending to be. His health problems all stemmed from decades of stress and burying his pain in work and food. He'd literally loved me to death. We sat in silence for a while, listening to cars pass by outside. My dad finished his beer and stood up slowly, before patting my shoulder. "Oh, and son," he said quietly, "Vinny was your biological father. He's coming here tomorrow to talk to you." My eyes shot open. "He's got a lot to say to you." I sat there frozen on the old paint-stained stool we'd had since I was a kid. My brain kept repeating those words like a broken record. Vinny was my biological father, the same guy who destroyed my parents' marriage not once, but twice. The same guy who came to our house for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Dad reached for another beer from the cooler, but his hands were shaking so bad he couldn't get a grip on the bottle. I stood up and took it from him, popping the cap with the opener hanging on the garage wall. He took a long drink, and we both just sat there staring at the concrete floor. Neither of us knew what to say. The garage felt smaller than usual with all these secrets filling up the space. A car drove by outside, and the headlights swept across the wall through the window. Dad finished half the beer in one go and set it down on the workbench. His breathing was rough, and I could hear him trying to steady it. I finally managed to speak, but my voice came out weird and scratchy. I told him I needed to go home and think about all this. He nodded like he expected that. Then he cleared his throat and said Vinny wasn't even his real name. His actual name was Alonzo Esposito, and he'd be here at noon tomorrow if I wanted to be there for the conversation. I grabbed my keys from the workbench and walked to my car without saying anything else. The drive home was strange because my body was on autopilot, while my brain was somewhere else entirely. I nearly missed my exit off the highway because I was thinking about every family gathering we'd ever had, every birthday party where Alonzo showed up with a gift, every holiday dinner where he sat at our table eating Mom's cooking, every time he patted my shoulder and asked about school or sports or whatever I was doing. He knew the whole time that I was his son. He knew, and he still showed up and played uncle like nothing was wrong. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. My place felt different somehow, like finding out this secret had changed the actual walls and furniture. I went straight to the hall closet where I kept old photo albums Mom had given me when I moved out. I pulled them down and spread them across the living room floor, page after page of family photos with this new, horrible context. There was Alonzo at my high school graduation standing right next to Dad, both of them smiling for the camera, while I stood between them in my cap and gown. There was Alonzo at my 10th birthday party helping me blow out the candles. There was Alonzo teaching me to throw a football in the backyard when I was 7. Dad was in the background of that photo watching us. Now I understood the look on his face that I'd never noticed before. I closed the albums and left them scattered on the floor. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I just laid there staring at the ceiling fan going around and around. My brain wouldn't stop thinking about Mom and how she looked Dad in the eyes every single day for decades. She made him breakfast and dinner. She slept next to him. She went to church with him every Sunday. She did all that knowing she'd betrayed him with Alonzo twice. She did all that knowing her son wasn't really her husband's child. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and got up to make coffee. I found a legal pad in my desk drawer and started writing down questions for Alonzo. Did he ever plan to tell me the truth? Did he feel guilty when he came to our family events? What did he want from me now that the secret was out? Did he expect me to call him Dad? Did he think we'd have some kind of relationship? The list kept growing as more questions popped into my head. By the time the sun came up, I had 3 pages filled with questions. At 6 in the morning, I texted Dad asking if we could meet before Alonzo showed up. He texted back immediately with just one word: yes. It was obvious he hadn't slept either. We agreed to meet at his house at 10 to figure out how to handle this meeting. I showered and tried to eat something, but food tasted like cardboard. I drove to Dad's house and got there right at 10. He answered the door before I could knock. He looked worse than yesterday with dark circles under his eyes and his skin all pale. He'd made a pot of coffee, but when he tried to pour me a cup, his hands were shaking so bad the coffee splashed on the counter. I took the pot from him and poured 2 cups. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together as a family. Dad looked at me, and I realized I should probably start calling him by his actual name, Murray. His name was Murray, and he wasn't technically my biological father, even though he'd raised me from birth. Murray told me he wanted to be there for the meeting with Alonzo, but he'd stay quiet unless I needed him to speak up. He admitted he'd already called Alonzo last night and told him I knew everything. That explained why this meeting was happening so fast. Alonzo had been waiting for this moment, and now he was ready to swoop in and claim his place, or whatever he thought was going to happen. Murray pulled out a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer and started writing down rules for the meeting, while I watched his hand shake slightly as he gripped the pen. We agreed on no physical contact at all, not even a handshake, and Murray wrote that at the top of the list in capital letters. He added that Alonzo couldn't claim any kind of fatherhood role or use parental terms, and I nodded while he underlined it twice. Murray kept stopping to apologize for putting me in this situation, but I told him to quit it, because none of this was his fault, and he was the only victim here who'd done nothing wrong. We spent the next hour going through every possible scenario and what we'd accept, with Murray writing everything down like it was a contract we could enforce. He made coffee, and we both just sat there watching the clock on the microwave tick closer to noon, while my stomach felt like it was full of rocks. At 11:45, Murray moved to the front window and stood there watching the street while I paced around the living room trying to calm my nerves. Right at noon, a black sedan pulled into the driveway, and I watched through the window as Alonzo sat in his car for a full minute before getting out. Murray squeezed my shoulder hard enough that I felt his fingers trembling, and we moved to the living room to wait. The knock came exactly 30 seconds later, 3 quick raps that made my chest tighten. Murray opened the door, and Alonzo walked in, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis, like this was some kind of job interview. The first words out of his mouth were, "Hey, kiddo," and I felt my hands ball into fists. I told him firmly he didn't get to call me that. Not now, not ever, and his face actually dropped like I'd hurt his feelings. We all sat down in the living room with Murray and me on the couch, and Alonzo in the armchair across from us. Alonzo launched right into this whole story about how he and my mom had been close since they were teenagers, growing up in the same neighborhood. He said they'd always had feelings for each other, but tried to fight it because they knew it was wrong, talking about it like some tragic love story instead of what it really was. He kept using words like connection and meant to be, while Murray sat next to me, getting more and more tense with every word. I cut him off and asked point blank why he came to the wedding if he was already sleeping with the bride. Alonzo looked down at his hands and admitted it was selfish and wrong, but then immediately tried to justify it by saying Mom was confused about her feelings and didn't know what she really wanted. Murray's whole body went rigid beside me, and I could feel him holding back from saying something. Alonzo kept talking about how they'd tried to stay apart after the honeymoon, but couldn't help themselves, like they had no control over their own actions. Then, out of nowhere, he offered to take a DNA test to prove he was my biological father, which caught me completely off guard since we all knew it was true already. I agreed to the test, but made it clear there would be no contact at all until we got the results, and even then only if I decided I wanted any kind of relationship. Murray suddenly spoke up for the first time, his voice steady, but with this edge I'd never heard before. He started listing every single family event Alonzo had attended over the years, knowing the truth, every Christmas dinner, every birthday party where he'd played the role of fun uncle while Murray raised me. His voice got harder with each event he named, and I could hear 30 years of rage he'd been holding back. Alonzo had the nerve to say he'd stayed in our lives because he wanted to watch me grow up, that he couldn't stand the thought of not knowing me. That's when I lost it completely, and told him he didn't get to claim any parental pride or connection. When Murray was the one who'd done all the actual work of raising me, teaching me to ride a bike, helping with homework, showing up to every single game and school event. I stood up and told him to leave, that we were done for now, and he actually looked surprised like he'd expected this to go differently. After he left Murray, and I just sat there in silence for a while before I went home to try to process everything that had just happened. The next morning I woke up early and called the DNA testing lab downtown to make an appointment for later that week. The woman on the phone explained the process in this clinical, detached way that actually felt comforting because it was something concrete and scientific in all this emotional chaos. Right after that call, I looked up therapists in my insurance network and found one who specialized in family trauma. The receptionist could tell something was urgent in my voice and got me an emergency appointment with someone named Karina Chan for 2 days later. I spent the rest of that morning writing down everything I could remember about growing up, trying to spot signs I'd missed, wondering how many family members knew the truth, while I'd been completely oblivious to the massive lie my entire life was built on. 2 days later, I walked into Karina's office and sat down on this brown couch that had seen way too many tears. She had glasses and short gray hair, and this calm way of sitting that made me feel safe enough to just start talking. I told her everything Murray had said in the garage and about meeting Alonzo and how my whole life felt fake now. She listened without writing anything down, and when I finished, she leaned forward and said, what I was feeling made complete sense. She explained that finding out your whole family history was built on lies was a massive betrayal, and my anger at everyone was totally normal. The session went by fast, and when I left, I felt a tiny bit less crazy for being so mad at my dead mom. The next morning, I asked Murray for Pastor Williams's full name while we were having coffee at his kitchen table. He looked confused but told me it was Raymondson Nash, and he was still preaching at the same church we went to when I was a kid. Part of me wanted to drive there right then and tell him what his advice had cost my family, but Murray asked me to think about it first. I couldn't stop thinking about it though, and 3 days later, I drove to the church during office hours. The building looked exactly the same with its white steeple and red doors, and I found Pastor Nash in his office going through papers. He was in his 70s now with thin white hair, and when I told him who I was, his face lit up until I explained why I was there. I told him about Murray's 30 years of misery and how his advice to stay married had destroyed my dad's health and happiness. His face went pale, and he sat down hard in his chair and admitted he'd given that same advice to dozens of couples over the years. He kept shaking his head and saying he thought he was helping people honor their vows, but now he could see how much damage that rigid thinking had caused. Then he asked if Murray would be willing to meet with him so he could apologize properly, which surprised me because I expected him to get defensive. I told him I'd ask, but couldn't promise anything, and left feeling weird about the whole thing. That evening I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with an email from Alonzo with an attachment labeled, "Thought you should see this." Against every bit of common sense I had, I opened it and found a scanned letter in my mom's handwriting, dated 3 years before she died. The letter was addressed to Alonzo, but apparently never sent, and reading it made me want to throw my phone across the room. She wrote about feeling trapped between duty and desire, and how she loved both men, but in different ways. The worst part was when she called Murray a good provider and said staying with him gave her stability and a nice house and good insurance. She wrote about Alonzo being her passion and Murray being her safety net, like he was just a paycheck with legs instead of a person with feelings. I had to read it 3 times before I could really process that my mom had reduced the man who raised me to a financial plan. 2 days later, I was at Murray's helping him organize his pills when he grabbed his chest and said something felt wrong. His face was gray and sweaty, and I didn't wait for him to argue, just called 911 and got him in my car. The ER was packed, but they took him back immediately when I said chest pains and heart failure history. They hooked him up to machines and ran tests while I sat in a plastic chair trying not to panic. The doctor came out after 2 hours and said it was stress-related, but his heart couldn't take much more strain, and they were keeping him overnight for observation. I called Karina from the hospital waiting room, and she actually came to meet me there, which wasn't normal, but she could tell I was losing it. We sat in the hospital cafeteria, and she helped me work through what really mattered to me and what my values were. She made me realize that DNA didn't matter, because Murray chose to raise me every single day for 30 years, while Alonzo just showed up for the fun parts. She helped me see that being a father meant showing up when things were hard, not just when they were easy. After Murray got settled in his room and fell asleep, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since learning everything. Mom's headstone still had fresh flowers from someone, and I stood there in the dark, talking out loud like she could hear me. I told her gravestone how mad I was that she stole Murray's chance at real love and happiness, and how she used him like he was just a wallet. I told her she was selfish and cruel, and that Murray deserved so much better than what she gave him. Nobody was around, so I just kept talking until my throat hurt, and then I sat on the grass feeling empty. That weekend, after Murray was home and resting, I went through more old photo albums from different years. Once I knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere, like Murray's smile that never reached his eyes in any picture with Mom. In every photo, they stood slightly apart, like he was keeping invisible distance between them, even at their anniversary parties. There was this one Christmas photo where everyone was laughing at something, but Murray was just staring at nothing with this blank look. In pictures from my birthday parties, he was always focused on me, never looking at Mom, even when she was right next to him. 3 days later, Murray got discharged from the hospital, and I drove him home with a bag full of new medications and strict orders to avoid stress. I stayed at his place to help out and make sure he took his pills on time and didn't try to do too much around the house. The first couple days, we just watched old movies and I made simple meals while he rested on the couch looking pale, but better than he had in the hospital. On the 3rd evening after dinner, Murray pulled out his phone and started recording something while I was washing dishes. He talked into the phone for maybe 10 minutes, and when I asked what he was doing, he said he wanted to record some memories before he forgot them. Later that night, after he went to bed, I found the phone on the coffee table and played the recording with my earbuds in. Murray's voice was quiet and tired as he described the night he almost left when I was 6 years old. He talked about loading his car in the dark and walking back into the house one last time to check on me. He described standing in my doorway, watching me sleep with that teddy bear pressed against my chest, and how something broke inside him, knowing he couldn't leave. The recording went on about how he sat on my bedroom floor for an hour, just watching me breathe, and thinking about what kind of life I'd have if he left. Something cracked inside me, listening to his voice describe choosing to stay for me, and I started crying hard for the first time since this whole mess started. Murray must have heard me, because he came out of his room and sat next to me on the couch while I sobbed into my hands. I told him through the tears that I understood why he stayed, but wished he'd chosen himself too, and not sacrificed everything. Murray pulled me into a hug and said raising me was the only thing that made all those years worthwhile, and that he'd do it again, even knowing the cost. We sat there for a long time, not saying anything else while I tried to pull myself together, and Murray rubbed my back like he used to when I was little. The next morning, Murray's phone rang while we were eating breakfast, and it was Pastor Nash calling directly. I could hear parts of the conversation as Nash invited both of us to meet with him at the church to discuss what happened all those years ago. Murray looked at me across the table and then told Nash he'd come because he needed to hear the apology, even if it was decades too late. We scheduled it for 2 days later, which gave Murray time to rest up for the trip since the church was across town. The morning of the church meeting, Murray asked me to come to his bedroom where he opened his closet and pulled out an old shoebox from behind some winter coats. Inside was a small bank book from an account I'd never heard of, and Murray explained this was money he'd been saving secretly for 30 years. He logged into the bank app on his phone and showed me the balance before transferring every penny into my account, right there in front of me. He said he wanted me to have choices he never had and the freedom to leave any situation that wasn't right for me. Looking at the transaction history, I could see deposits of $20 here and $50 there going back decades. Murray must have been skipping lunches and finding tiny ways to save without Mom noticing because the deposits were always small and random. It wasn't a fortune, but seeing 30 years of $5 deposits and $10 transfers made me realize how long he'd been planning an escape he never took. The account had almost $40,000, which sounds like a lot, but spread over 30 years meant he'd been saving just over $100 a month. Each deposit represented a choice to stay, despite having the means to leave and start over somewhere else. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Alonzo, and when I opened it, there was a photo of him holding me as a baby at what looked like some family party. I immediately texted back, telling him this violated our agreement to have no contact until the DNA results came in, and he needed to respect the boundaries I'd set. I made it crystal clear that sending photos and trying to force a connection before I was ready would only push me away permanently and make me less likely to want any relationship later. Alonzo texted back with just, sorry, but I could tell from how quick the response came that he didn't really understand why I was upset or why boundaries mattered. 2 days later, I had my regular session with Karina, and we spent the whole hour practicing scripts for maintaining boundaries with Alonzo. She taught me about something called the window of tolerance, which is basically the emotional zone where you can handle stress without shutting down or freaking out. She reminded me over and over that I didn't owe Alonzo anything, regardless of what the DNA test showed, and that biology didn't create obligations. We role-played different scenarios where Alonzo might push boundaries, and I practiced firm responses until they felt natural instead of mean. That afternoon, the DNA lab called to say the results would be ready tomorrow, and I could either pick them up in person or have them emailed. My chest got tight, just hearing the words, and knowing that scientific proof would make this whole situation undeniably real instead of just Murray's story. Murray offered to come with me to get the results, but I decided I needed to do this part alone, without anyone else's reactions affecting how I processed it. That evening, Murray and I sat at his kitchen table with a notepad planning for both scenarios, even though we both knew what the results would say. We talked through what we'd do if somehow it came back negative, which seemed impossible, but Murray said we should be prepared for anything. Then we planned for the more likely confirmation, and Murray kept saying nothing would change between us, because he was my dad, regardless of what any test said. We agreed that DNA was just biology, but being a father meant showing up every day for 30 years like Murray had done. He grabbed my hand across the table and told me I'd always be his son, no matter what some lab report said about genetics. The next morning, Murray and I drove to the church to meet with Pastor Nash, who'd agreed to see us after Murray called him. The church looked exactly the same as when I was a kid, except the parking lot had more cracks and the sign needed new paint. Pastor Nash met us in his office, which still smelled like old books and that weird church carpet smell that never goes away. He looked older than I expected, with white hair and deep lines around his eyes that made him seem tired. Murray sat next to me on the couch, while Pastor Nash took the chair across from us and folded his hands in his lap. He started by looking directly at Murray and saying he'd been thinking about their conversation from 30 years ago every day since Murray called. He admitted the advice he gave back then was wrong and harmful, and he'd spent years realizing how much damage those rigid teachings caused. He said the church's old stance that divorce was unforgivable, no matter what had trapped too many people in terrible situations. He told Murray he was deeply sorry for using scripture to guilt him into staying in a marriage that was destroying him. Murray just sat there nodding while tears rolled down his face, and I could see his shoulders getting lighter with each word. Pastor Nash turned to me and said he understood if I was angry at the church and at him for what happened to my family. I told him straight up that I wasn't looking to come back to church or forgive on anyone's timeline, but his. I said I appreciated him owning the harm, even if it was decades too late to fix anything. Murray reached over and squeezed my hand, while Pastor Nash nodded and said that was completely fair and understandable. We left after about 20 minutes, and Murray seemed different somehow, like a weight he didn't know he was carrying had finally lifted. That afternoon, I drove to the DNA testing lab to pick up the results that I already knew would confirm everything. My hands shook as I signed for the envelope, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before opening it. The paper inside had all these numbers and scientific terms, but the only part that mattered was at the bottom. Probability of paternity between Alonzo Esposito and subject was 99.9%, which meant it was basically certain he was my biological father. Seeing it written out in black and white with official letterhead and signatures made it real in a way that punched me in the gut. I felt this weird mix of grief for the dad I thought I had, and relief that at least now there was no more wondering. I called Murray right away, and when he answered, I couldn't even speak for a few seconds. He just said my name softly, and then told me I was still his son no matter what any paper said. That made me cry harder than I had since this whole mess started, and I sat there in that parking lot sobbing. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from Alonzo asking if I'd gotten the results yet. When I said yes, He immediately texted back wanting to meet and discuss next steps, like we were planning some kind of business deal. I typed back that I needed time to process everything and would contact him when I was ready, not the other way around. He sent 3 more texts in the next 5 minutes, asking when that might be, and saying we had lots to talk about. I turned off my phone and drove to Murray's house where we sat at his kitchen table, not really talking, just being together. After a while, Murray brought up the subject of what we'd call each other going forward now that everything was confirmed. I told him he was dad, period, and always would be no matter what some test said about DNA. He started crying again and said he'd been so scared I'd want to call Alonzo dad now that we knew for sure. I said Alonzo was just Alonzo, or biological father if medical stuff came up, but Murray was the one who earned the title dad. We hugged for a long time, and then ordered pizza and watched a baseball game like we used to when I was a kid. The next day, I sat at my computer and started writing out a formal boundary agreement for Alonzo, spelling out exactly what I would and wouldn't accept. I included stuff like meeting frequency, which would be once a month maximum, and only if I confirmed the week before. I wrote that acceptable topics were limited to present-day stuff and his medical history, but nothing about the past with my mom. I made it clear he couldn't show up at my apartment or workplace uninvited and couldn't contact Murray directly about me. Karina helped me refine it during our session, making sure it was firm, but not unnecessarily mean or hostile. She reminded me that boundaries weren't punishments, but protections, and I had every right to set whatever limits I needed. When I emailed the document to Alonzo that evening, he responded within minutes, saying I was being unfair and unreasonable. He wrote this long, rambling email about how he had rights as my biological father, and I couldn't just shut him out. I didn't respond, and after a full day of silence, he sent another email agreeing to try things my way for now. 2 days later, Murray handed me an envelope with my name written on the front in his shaky handwriting. He said it was a letter about self-respect and choosing happiness that he wished someone had written to him at 23. His hands trembled as he gave it to me, and he told me to read it when I felt ready, not before. That night, I sat on my bed and opened Murray's letter, which was 3 pages of his careful printing on yellow legal paper. He wrote about how he'd spent 30 years putting everyone else's comfort above his own worth, and it had literally almost killed him. He said self-respect wasn't selfish, and choosing your own happiness wasn't betraying anyone who truly loved you. He wrote that he hoped I'd be braver than he was, and would never stay in any situation that made me feel less than whole. The last part said he was proud of how I was handling everything, and setting boundaries he never knew how to set. He signed it, "Love always, Dad," and I had to put it down, because I couldn't see through the tears anymore. The next morning, I called Karina's office and scheduled an emergency session for that afternoon, because I needed help figuring out how to handle seeing Alonzo again. When I got to her office, she had me write out all my fears about re-engaging with him on sticky notes, and we stuck them on the wall. We spent the whole hour creating a structured plan with specific checkpoints where I could pause or completely stop contact if things got too overwhelming. She helped me write down exact phrases I could use to maintain boundaries, and we practiced them until they felt natural. Having an exit strategy for every possible scenario made me feel less trapped and more in control of whatever came next. 3 days later, I texted Alonzo that I was willing to meet once at a coffee shop downtown, but only for 30 minutes, and he had to arrive first. When I walked into the coffee shop that Saturday morning, he was already sitting at a corner table looking genuinely nervous, which caught me off guard. He stood up when he saw me, but sat back down when I shook my head at the gesture. The villain I'd built up in my head for weeks didn't match this anxious older man fidgeting with his coffee cup. He started talking immediately, and for once it wasn't excuses or justifications, but an actual apology listing specific harms he'd caused. He acknowledged betraying Murray's trust and friendship, lying by omission for 30 years, and letting another man raise me while he played uncle at family gatherings. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he needed me to know he was sorry for all of it. I sat there listening without responding, because Karina had told me I didn't owe him forgiveness or even acknowledgement. When our 30 minutes were up, I stood to leave and told him I'd think about whether we'd meet again. 2 days later, Pastor Nash called Murray and offered to facilitate a formal meeting between him and Alonzo, using some structure from restorative justice programs. Murray surprised me by agreeing immediately and said he needed to voice decades of pain directly to the person who'd caused it. We scheduled it for the following week at the church, in a small conference room instead of Nash's main office. Murray spent days writing down everything he wanted to say and practiced reading it out loud to make sure he could get through it. When the day came, I drove Murray to the church and stayed in the waiting room while they met. Through the door, I could hear Murray's voice steady but full of emotion as he listed every single cost of Alonzo's betrayal. He talked about his destroyed health from decades of stress, his lost chance at finding real love with someone faithful, and 30 years of his life spent in misery. He described specific moments like sitting through family dinners, wanting to scream the truth, and lying next to my mom, knowing she'd been with Alonzo. From what I could hear, Alonzo just sat there taking it without defending himself, or making excuses, which seemed to be exactly what Murray needed. After an hour, Murray came out looking exhausted, but somehow lighter, like he'd finally put down something heavy he'd been carrying. That night, I sat at my computer staring at forms to legally change my name, and after hours of going back and forth, I decided to keep Kelly as my surname. Murray had earned the right to have me carry his name through 30 years of actual parenting, while Alonzo had just provided DNA. The next morning, I told Murray my decision, and he grabbed my hand, so tight I thought he might break it. We started a new routine that week with dinner every Wednesday at his favorite diner and short walks around his neighborhood that his heart could handle. These became our sacred time, where we could talk about baseball or work or nothing at all, without the weight of secrets hanging over us. Sometimes we'd sit on his porch watching cars go by, and I'd help him with his medications, or just keep him company. It felt like we were finally having the relationship we should have had all along, without my mom's betrayal poisoning everything. A week later, Alonzo mailed me a thick envelope with his complete family medical history going back 3 generations. Reading through it, I found out his father and grandfather both had heart disease and diabetes, which meant I needed to start monitoring things I hadn't worried about before. It was actually useful information, even though I resented needing anything from him, or having to think about his family as connected to me. I took the papers to my doctor's office the next day to update my records, and felt weird crossing out Murray's information on the forms. The nurse saw me hesitating and said I could list both fathers if I wanted, since one was biological and one was who raised me. I wrote them both down, and somehow that felt right, like I was acknowledging the complicated truth, instead of pretending it was simple. A month after everything had come out, I drove back to the cemetery where my mom was buried. Standing at her headstone, I could finally acknowledge both truths about her, without the rage making me want to scream. She was selfish and destructive, and had hurt everyone who loved her, but she was also human and flawed, and probably dealing with her own problems I'd never know about. I didn't forgive her, because I wasn't ready for that yet, but the burning anger had cooled into sadness for all the damage she'd caused, and all the happiness she'd stolen from Murray and from herself. The next week, Karina and I sat in her office working through scripts for telling my closest friends about everything without turning it into a soap opera. She had me practice saying it out loud while she timed me to keep it under 2 minutes, because anything longer would invite too many questions I wasn't ready to answer. We settled on something simple that acknowledged the facts without drowning people in details about betrayal and decades of lies. I tried it out on my buddy from work first, and he just nodded and bought the next round of beers without making it weird, which was exactly what I needed. A few days later, Murray suggested we go back to the garage where everything started, and I helped him move some boxes around while we talked about normal stuff like the game last night. He pulled out his phone and asked if we could take a picture together right there by the workbench, where he'd first told me the truth. I set up the timer, and we stood there side by side, both of us looking tired, but somehow lighter than we'd been in months. Murray printed the photo that same afternoon and put it in a wooden frame on his mantel next to pictures of me at graduation and Little League. Every time I came over and saw it there next to the other family photos, I had to look away, because it made my chest tight in a way I couldn't explain. Pastor Nash called Murray that week to tell him the church board had approved new counseling guidelines that specifically addressed situations where staying in destructive marriages caused harm. Murray listened on speakerphone while Nash explained how they'd bring in trained therapists instead of just relying on scripture and prayer. Murray just said it was good that maybe other people wouldn't waste 30 years of their life, but I could tell from how he gripped his coffee mug that hearing about it still hurt. Alonzo kept texting me every few days asking to meet up, and finally I agreed to 1 coffee meeting per month, with clear rules that I could cancel any time without explanation. We met at a chain coffee place near the highway where nobody we knew would run into us, and he showed up 15 minutes early looking nervous. He ordered my coffee wrong, but I didn't correct him, and we sat at a corner table while he talked about his job and tried to find common ground. When our hour was up, I stood to leave, and he thanked me 3 times for giving him even this small chance, which made me uncomfortable, but I just nodded and left. Murray's next cardiology appointment showed numbers that surprised his doctor, who kept double-checking the charts and asking what had changed. Murray just shrugged and said he'd finally stopped carrying other people's secrets, which the doctor didn't understand, but wrote down anyway. His blood pressure was down 20 points, and his heart rhythm had stabilized enough that they could reduce one of his medications. On the drive home, Murray said it was proof that lies literally kill you from the inside, and I couldn't argue with that. I started seeing things more clearly after a couple months of therapy and realized I didn't have to choose between the 2 truths about my fathers. Murray was dad because he'd earned that title through 30 years of showing up every single day, even when it was killing him. Alonzo was just biology and medical history and maybe occasional coffee But that didn't erase what Murray had done for me. Both things could exist without fighting each other for space in my head. 6 weeks after the garage confession, I was at the park near Murray's house helping him with his prescribed walks when we ran into Alonzo coming from the opposite direction. We all stopped and stood there for about 10 seconds that felt like forever before Alonzo said hi and asked how Murray was feeling. Murray said he was doing better and asked about Alonzo's mother who'd had hip surgery, which I didn't even know about. They talked for maybe a minute about weather and the new construction downtown, while I stood between them feeling weird, but not angry. Nobody pretended we were some kind of family, or that things were normal, but we managed to be polite humans occupying the same space for 90 seconds before going our separate ways. Life found its new rhythm over the next few weeks with therapy every other Thursday, where Karina helped me process whatever came up that week. Wednesday dinners with Murray became sacred time where we'd eat at his favorite diner and talk about everything except the past. Once a month, I'd meet Alonzo for exactly 1 hour of coffee, where he'd try too hard, and I'd give him just enough to keep him from pushing for more. It wasn't the family I'd grown up thinking I had, and it definitely wasn't perfect, but it was real and honest, which felt like enough for now. Thanks for hanging out and questioning things right alongside me today. Really enjoyed digging into all those curious little details together. Until we meet again, take care, subscribe for more content like this.